Okay, thank you everyone for joining this webinar. My name is Shaul Hanani, and I'm one of the two co-founders of USA for Israeli Democracy. USA for Israeli Democracy is a grassroots group focused on US-based actions to promote democracy in Israel. You can learn more about the group in the website that I will post later in the chat. I'd like to ask everyone if you have questions through the seminar. You can post them in the chat, or we will open the discussion later on. Please do not use the Q&A. Just use the chat. Everyone should be able to write in the chat. It is a great pleasure to welcome Professor Myers to talk to our group today. David N. Myers is Distinguished Professor of History and holds the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA, where he serves as the director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. He also directs the new UCLA initiative to study hate. Professor Myers is the author or editor of more than 15 books in the field of Jewish history, including with Nomi Stolzenberg, American Shtetl, The Making of Kiryas Joel, a Hasidic village in upstate New York. The book was awarded the 2022 National Jewish Book Award in American Jewish Studies. Between 2018 and 2023, Professor Myers served as the president of the New Israeli Fund. It's a great pleasure to have David. He will speak, and then we will open it up for questions. People can raise their hands, and I will unmute people. Thank you, David, for talking to us today. Go ahead.
Thank you, Shaul. Really a pleasure to be with you, to be amongst friends and comrades in this extraordinarily important moment in Jewish history, in the history of the State of Israel, in the history of Israel-diaspora relations. I want to begin on a high note. Last night represented the 20th week in a row in which demonstrators made their way to various sites in Israel, including in Tel Aviv. This is really a remarkable example of the staying power of what is a bottom-up movement of protest. In some sense, the best form of protest we can imagine, not one orchestrated from the top down, but really that takes rise from the bottom up, from what I think of as people power. And I want to say that we in Los Angeles have been meeting every week on Sunday at 11 a.m. in front of the Federal Building with the same degree of energy and determination that was present in the earliest weeks. Again, another manifestation of that staying power. 2 weeks ago, I was in Israel, and of course, as is my custom, I made my way on Motzei Shabbat on Saturday night to Rehov Kaplan, and I'm delighted to say that the first person I saw whom I knew was my friend Maisam Jaljuli, who is one of the leaders of the organization Omdim Biachad, Standing Together, which some of you may be familiar with, the grassroots organizing movement that has been so successful in recent years in mobilizing Jews and Arabs to stand together in pursuit of liberty, justice, and peace for all. It's still the case that there are not all that many Palestinian citizens of Israel that one encounters at the demonstrations on Saturday night. So it was very good to see Maisam and two of her Palestinian friends, really the first people whom I knew, whom I encountered at that protest. And that remains a goal as the task of expanding the camp continues. But what one is struck by, I want to say, in the demonstrations is the diversity within unity. I have never made my way in the 2 times that I've been to the Motzei Shabbat demonstrations. I've never made my way to the main stage. I've been sort of swept up into the crowd and encountered all sorts of different subunits of the protest movement. Physical therapists for democracy, physicists for democracy, Shaul, academics in general for democracy, social workers for democracy. And one place that I make my way to out of my own personal disposition is the corner of Kaplan and Da Vinci, which is the anti-occupation corner, the Gush Neged HaKibush corner. And that is sort of one part of this symphony of protesters who together make something whose whole is much larger than the sum of the parts. Of course, there are lots of flags. In fact, there's a sea of flags that one sees in Tel Aviv and elsewhere, as well as, for that matter, in Los Angeles, and the many places around the world outside of Israel where people are showing up to demand democracy in Israel. I should say, I'm not a flag waver myself, but I understand the power of the flag in the protest movement. And I really appreciate the reappropriation of the flag by the left and center of the Israeli political spectrum. That is an extremely significant development. And this, I think, relates to the first thing that I'd like to emphasize, which is to sustain and grow the movement. This kind of diversity and tolerance for difference will be necessary. It can be a challenge. So sometimes at our local protest in Los Angeles, there's a question, even some tension over whether people should carry signs or speak only about the threat to democracy represented by the judicial overhaul plan, or whether they can carry signs or speak about the occupation. What I'd say is it's understandable and normal for there to be tensions. They have to be acknowledged and managed. This is part of what building an organic, diverse yet powerful movement is about. At one level, and we see this issue in both local and national context, both in Los Angeles and in Israel. So at one level, the protests originated in and has focused on Netanyahu's judicial assault on democratic institutions and values. But since this is a protest about democracy, it would be ironic if it weren't tolerant of people who had different emphases or even visions of what democracy is and what it should entail. On the other hand, there is a very strong need to stay on message, to retain and expand the camp as much as possible. And as I said, this kind of tension between these impulses, or better yet, this kind of demand for flexibility is what accompanies and allows for the building up of movements that can sustain themselves. Diversity within unity, not lockstep conformity at every turn. It's interesting, in the case of Los Angeles, I have to say that there are people who come on a weekly basis who in the past are people with whom I have disagreed on our approaches to Israeli politics. And now we are partners. And there's something enormously powerful and empowering about that. The recognition that there is much more that unites us than divides us, that we are indeed partners in a shared project of immense significance for each of us individually and for the larger collective. So, of course, the question arises, can it be sustained? And I think even maybe preliminary to that question is, what explains the willingness of people to come out? And I'm thinking of people other than the usual suspects, other than the usual activists who are routinized to protest and do it with great frequency. What about the people for whom this is the first time experience, who never demonstrated against the government a day in their lives? Why is it? What explains their willingness to do so? I think part of the answer is that it has become actually a social happening. And I see this particularly amongst older Israelis, septuagenarian and octogenarian Israelis, who make it a weekly outing with their friends to leave home in the late afternoon, early evening on Saturday night and spend hours together, chatting, shouting, laughing. And I think that's part of the staying power. But it's obviously more than that. I think it's not a coincidence that the most common slogan after demokratia is busha, shame. People who come out, that is to say the hundreds of thousands of people who come out every week, feel a substantial dose of shame in the latest government. They feel shame in the figure of Bibi Netanyahu and the corruption that envelops him. They feel shame in the cast of characters he has assembled, including Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, as well as representatives of Haredi parties. And I think there's a sense that comes along with that shame that the reputation of Israeli democracy has been tarnished, and that what we're seeing is something that one doesn't frequently see in functioning democracies, but more in banana republics. I think there may be something even deeper than that. I think there's a sense that somehow this last government has ruptured the social compact of Israel, ruptured the compact that assures that in exchange for loyalty and service to the state will act equitably and fairly and wisely. And there's a sense that something has been broken. And I often think in this context of a concept drawn from the lexicon of the great early modern mystics from Safed or Tzfat in what was then northern Palestine, who understood the creation of the world as the result of what they called shivirat hakelim, the breaking of the vessels that held God's light, which overpowered these vessels and they were shattered. It seems to me that we are in a state in the history of Israel where the vessels have been shattered. It's a very terrifying proposition, to break the vessels. But there's something also extraordinarily generative and hopeful about that process. And it seems to me that somehow the rupture of the compact between the state and its citizens allows for the possibility of really the reconstitution of a better order than the one that exists, or even the one that preceded November 1st, 2022. What is it that went into the sense of rupture? What distresses or concerns people? There's really interesting evidence that comes from surveys that have been conducted. And I'm thinking particularly of survey that has been conducted by a friend of mine, a brilliant social psychologist by the name of Eran Halperin, professor at the Hebrew University, and his team at the Accord Research Center. And I want to thank Eran for sharing some of the information from his recent surveys. And I think he'd be just a great person to have speak to this group. Amongst the things that the Accord survey finds is that all three groups surveyed, meaning left, center, and right, are in pretty much agreement that the three top ethical values that they believe that the new government has challenged most are fairness, especially as reflected in the ideal of equality, social cohesion, as to say the sense of cohesiveness of Israeli society, and the rule of law. And particularly the rule of law as it's played out in the separation of powers between, say, the judiciary and the legislature. And alongside that, the four top political issues that matter most to the people who make their way to the demonstration on a weekly basis, as say people from both the left and the center, are fighting corruption, separation of religion and state, the idea of Jewish-Arab political partnership, and equality for all. This is important because it gives us a sense of what people have in mind when they are so activated by the threat to democracy. What is it that stands at the core of their vision of democracy? And we get a sense through this survey of some of the important ideals and practices that really undergird their sense of what democracy, what meaningful democracy should look like. And here I'd contrast sort of the majoritarian model favored by Bibi Netanyahu that says, if I have a majority of 61 in the Knesset, I have the authority, in this case 64, I have the authority to do whatever I want and impose whatever I want upon that substantial minority, which is really equal in size to the Netanyahu constituency. I'll say more at the end about the ideal of equality in particular, but what I want to do since I'm an historian, is try to situate the protest movement in context, or try to give some sense of the broader historical context, though I would say that what we are seeing is really unprecedented in the state of Israel. We've never seen an exertion of people power quite like this. There is a history of protests in Israel, going back to the early years of the state. Some of you may recall that in 1952, Menachem Begin led a group of some 15,000 protesters to the Knesset to voice their displeasure with the government's decision to accept reparations from the German government, which Begin thought was really sacrilege and a violation of the sanctity of life. Some of you may also recall that about 7 years later, there was an uprising in the Haifa neighborhood of Wadi Salib after the death of a Mizrahi Jew at the hands of a police person. This popular uprising was a significant moment in the history of Haifa, significant moment in sort of the unfolding history of Mizrahi political activism. But you're probably more familiar with more recent protests, and particularly what is known as the protest, the demonstration that took place in 1982 in the midst of the Lebanon War, which, as many people maintained, was the first war that Israel engaged in without a national consensus. And its outbreak in the summer of 1982 led to widespread protest, including that demonstration on September 26, 1982, at which it is alleged there were 400,000 people, however many there were. I was one of them. I was a graduate student at that time in Tel Aviv. That would represent 1/10 of Israel's population. And just so we remember, that protest had an impact. 2 days after it took place, a government commission of inquiry, the Kahan Commission, was appointed that, amongst other things, required Defense Minister Ariel Sharon to step down from that position. He remained in the government as a minister without portfolio, but the impact of the Kahan Commission's report was profound, especially on Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who eventually stepped down. Some of you may also recall that about 5 months later, in Jerusalem, February 10th, 1983, there was another demonstration against the war, much smaller, but one in which a bomb was thrown and an Israeli reserve officer by the name of Emil Greenszweig was killed, representing the insertion of violence into protest against the Lebanon war within Israel. We're also familiar with demonstrations both against and in support of the Oslo peace process in the 1990s, including the fateful rally on November 4th, 1995, in what was then called Kikar Malchei Yisrael, at the end of which Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by Yigal Amir, and subsequently that square was renamed Kikar Rabin. In the United States, there have been demonstrations related to Israel, chiefly in support of Israel, and especially in the lead up to the creation of the State of Israel. Large rallies at places like Madison Square Garden in late March 1948, in earlier 1947, even after the creation of the state in October 1948, when President Truman spoke to the group. There have also been large-scale rallies against the government of the State of Israel, populated almost exclusively by Haredi Jews over the years to protest various things, especially laws or proposals to require their mobilization into the IDF. Amongst non-Haredim in the mainstream Jewish community, protests against the Israeli government have been relatively rare, and I think that really bespeaks what is a kind of hyper-conformist sensibility that took rise after 1948. That is to say, after American Jewry began to transform itself from an agnostic position towards Zionism into a very strongly pro-Zionist position. But there are exceptions to that hyperconformism. I'd call your attention to an organization called Brera that took rise in 1973, existed for about 5 years. Brera, the word means choice or alternative. It stood for the principle that there should be an alternative to the path of war. And it was one of the first American Jewish organizations to call for the creation of 2 states in the region. The 1982 Lebanon War not only engendered significant protest in Israel, but also in the United States. We saw for the first time expressions of opposition from prominent American and world Jews. Think in particular of the prominent American Jewish leader, Philip Klutznick, who joined forces with 2 colleagues to create a new statement calling for negotiation with the PLO and movement towards a solution that allowed for national self-determination for Palestinians. 1982, I think, begins a movement of loosening up, what's a gradual process of loosening up that hyperconformist sensibility that was so characteristic of American Jewry up to that point, and indeed for a good portion of time after it. What I think really succeeded in cracking open the discourse on Israel within American Jewry, what really allowed for a new openness to critical perspectives, drawing on some of the effects of that post-1982 era, was the creation of J Street in 2007. And I think what's important about J Street is the extent to which it is both a cause and a symptom of developments that had been, particularly a symptom of developments that had been brewing for several decades. And I think here it's significant to point out the importance of generational strains, the emergence, which I think J Street represents, of divergent generational perspectives on Israel. I may belong to maybe one of the younger members of a generation that took rise in the wake of the Holocaust, for whom the key question was the existential question: how can we assure the survival of the Jews? That's not the question that my daughter's generation asks, or asked so frequently. They ask different questions, like how can we make sense of this entity, Israel, which seems to us not to be beleaguered, but the strongest force in the neighborhood, and some of its actions without the sense of existential angst born of the Holocaust. And so we have seen, certainly since the time of the creation of J Street, and even prior to that, growing distance of younger generations from unquestioned support and an appreciation or recognition of the existential significance of Israel. Again, as we move further away from the Holocaust, this seems to me like an understandable and natural development. And I mentioned this in the context of this sort of brief history of protest movements, because one of the most prominent ones over the last decade was the emergence in 2014 of a group of young Jews called, assembled under the name If Not Now, who protested Israel's military operation in Gaza, Tzuk Eitan, Protective Edge, which they thought was a manifestation of highly disproportionate application of military power. So I think gradually since 1982, we've seen the dissolving of that tight bond between the American Jewish community and the positions of the government of Israel. And we've also seen that the spectrum of organizational perspectives has become more crowded. On the right wing, we have AIPAC, and even further right, the ZOA. Sort of in the center right, the ADL, the American Jewish Committee. On the left, J Street, Americans for Peace Now, and the New Israel Fund. and further to the left, sort of adopting a more radical perspective, Jewish Voice for Peace, all asserting the right to speak in the name or advance a perspective within the Jewish community. And much of that action has been driven, much of that increased diversity, I think, has been driven by younger Jews, some of whom, but not all of whom, identify themselves as Zionists. So when I think about the protest movement that we are all part of, that we belong to, I think it's fair to say that it draws on some of the energy of these previous protest movements, but it also seems to me to be somewhat different. I may be wrong about this, but it seems to me not to be led by youth. It features the appearance of an important new group in American Jewish life, which is to say Israeli Americans. Many of you know of the existence of the IAC, which is itself a new phenomenon on the landscape of American Jewry. And here in the protest movement, it's so striking in Los Angeles how large a percentage of the organizers and participants are Israeli Americans, which seems to me like a incredibly salutary positive development. And for many, it has the goal of reclaiming Zionism and setting it on a more just path, unlike earlier, some of the younger generations for whom Zionism is not a relevant category or a highly problematic category. So what does that mean? And where are we headed? And for me, this really is the question of how do we transform this rather extraordinary manifestation of people power into a movement of change. The great power of such protests is the bottom-up energy and the spontaneity. And yet at a certain point, one needs to navigate and guide and think strategically about translating that really remarkable spontaneous power into substantial enduring change. So what might that look like? What might be some of the tangible results that could emerge out of the translation of this power into change? So I think of this in terms of stages or rounds. In round one, and here I think it's absolutely essential to think in short-term and long-term modes. So in the short term, round one, the goal is the prevention of the judicial overhaul, doing all that one can to prevent the Piskat Hitgabrut, the override clause, from being passed, which would allow 61 members of the Knesset to override a decision of the Supreme Court. And some of the surveying that Iran and Accord have done show that people are in favor of a much higher threshold, maybe as many as 90 members of Knesset, to justify an override clause if one were to pass. Also, a significant component of the judicial overhaul is the committee, the way in which judges and legal advisors for ministries is selected. The proposal of the government would completely politicize that process and remove every remaining element of professional expertise and accountability. And so preventing that, it seems to me, and I think most would agree, is the first objective of the protest movement. I'd say stage 1.5 is doing all that can be done to see that Bibi Netanyahu no longer serve as prime minister. It is, he's a man surrounded by corruption. He has outlived, in my view, his usefulness as a political actor on the stage. And it would be, I think, an important development to have him leave the scene of political life. But I think there are longer term goals, both beyond preventing the judicial overhaul and seeing to Netanyahu's removal or retirement. And here I think for me, and I speak only for myself, I speak on behalf of no organization or other coalition of people, but just as I see it, it would be, it is important to think of translating the people power that we've seen into an expansion of the ethos of equality and to enshrine it in law. So you'll recall that the 13th paragraph of the Declaration of Independence says that the state of Israel, and here I'm going to quote, will be based on liberty, justice, and peace, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel, Cherut, Tzedek, v'Shalom. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. And thus we have the extent or entirety of the principle of equality in Israeli political and legal documents. Seems to me, and I know there are others out there in Israel who hold to the view that this principle of equality needs to be enshrined in a basic law of the Knesset. And in so doing, it should serve as a counterbalance to the nation state law of 2018, which really spoke of the exclusive rights of Jews to the land of Israel and to a state. It's important to know that the nation state law was the product of many years of labor by people in the Kohelet Forum, who quite skillfully steered it through many different phases, including into the halls of the Knesset, such that it was passed. And that same kind of deliberate, concerted work, I think, needs to go into assuring that values such as equality are enshrined into the very DNA of the state of Israel. So this would be one example of a longer term goal that can emerge in staged form out of the protest movement. And it's an ideal that is, by the way, articulated by people across the political spectrum, especially on the left and center, as one of the top objectives or one of the top values that they hold dear. So too is the idea of Arab-Jewish partnership. And as you know, in the last government, the so-called government of change, the Bennett-Lapid government, there was an Arab party, the United Arab Party of Mansour Abbas, that was part of the governing coalition. For the first time in Israeli political history, an Arab, sort of an independent Arab party was part of the governing coalition. And it seems to me that moving forward, it should no longer be the case that there's a taboo against that, but there really should never be another governing coalition in Israel that does not have an Arab party as part of it. And that, of course, raises the idea of Arab political enfranchisement, brings us to sort of the most challenging and I think corrosive element in Israeli political life, which is the occupation. And somehow it seems to me we need to think of how to translate the extraordinary political power of this movement into longer term goals that really can assure the peaceful coexistence of Jews and Arabs in this land for generations to come, for our children and our grandchildren. All right, what about in the United States? What are some of the goals that we may need to think about, may want to think about? How can we translate this protest into meaningful change? Well, I think it's important to bring the power of the protest from the street back into American Jewish communal institutions, into organizations, synagogues, schools, summer camps. I think it's important that we insist that those institutions recognize the energy that has been so manifest as an example of a new political moment that is worthy of appreciation. And we should see it as a corrective to that old insistence on conformity. I think schools and synagogues should be giving space to the protest, seeing it not as a threat, but as a source of vitality, source of creativity, and indeed a source of loyalty to the best ideals articulated in Israel's Declaration of Independence. So we all should be going back to the Israel Action Committees and the organizations, synagogues that we belong to. We should be talking to administrators at the schools that our kids and grandkids go to. We should be talking to the leaders of the organizations that we belong to. We should, by the way, also, as an aside to the educational piece, insisting that maps of the state of Israel recognize the green line. We should also be explaining our viewpoint on this current moment to elected officials who are in a position to make decisions. It's really important that we build upon our shared commitment to democracy and make clear that we are fighting for democracy and articulate that to people who are upholders of the democratic order in this country. It's really important, although I know it's painful for some, but really important to make clear that the Jewish community does not speak in one voice, but there are multiple voices, multiple perspectives, and we represent one strand that stands for a better and more just future. I think it would be unfortunate if we didn't exploit the opportunity that this crisis has brought. That does mean distinguishing between short-term goals that require tolerance and patience, discipline and unity, and longer-term goals, which require strategic vision and courage. As I think of this, and with this I'll conclude, it seems to me that the odds of meaningful structural change that can reverse the 15-year reign of Bibi Netanyahu since 2009, and all the damage it has done to Israel, the odds of significant structural change are low, but they have never been higher in our lifetime. And so it is our job to do as much as we can to realize the opportunity at hand. With that, I'll conclude, Shaul.
Thank you very much, David. Very well, very good talk, very well given. Thank you. There are a number of questions by audience members. And so I'll start with the very top. You talked about Iran's survey, and I think you first gave a 3 and a 4, and someone is asking, can you repeat the? Someone is asking about Louis is asking about repeat the 4 values, but you had a 3 and a 4. Maybe you can repeat both.
Yeah, I will be happy to do that. Let me just find my list of those values. And indeed, that is my friend Lois who's asking. Let's see. Yeah, so the 3 really moral or ethical principles that those across the political spectrum gave voice to in the wake of the protest are fairness, social cohesion, and the rule of law. And fairness was broken down and defined as a belief in the principle of equality, social cohesion, a belief in the cohesiveness of Israeli society, and the rule of law as particularly respect for the separation of powers. So those are the 3 sort of guiding ethical values that Iran and Accord surveyed in the 3 groups that they surveyed. The 4 top political issues that animated people on the center and left who go to the demonstration. So that's not including the right, who are not showing up to the demonstration, at least not anywhere near in the same numbers as the center and left. The 4 top issues for them are corruption, separation of church, of religion and state, Jewish-Arab political partnership, and the ideal of equality for all.
Okay, thank you. I'll jump ahead here, and then I'll go back. Please share how can we support democracy in Israel, also how to influence and convince people to join current rally in North America. And so I'll let you respond, and I have a word as well for that, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, I would just repeat what I said for the latter part of that question. I think it's really important that each of us see ourselves as ambassadors or representatives of this extraordinary movement, of which we're really privileged and blessed to be part. In our lifetime, we really haven't had something in which we can feel so fully and wholly we're fighting for the right cause. And I think it's important for us to communicate that to our friends and colleagues. Each of us should endeavor, if you're in a city where there's a demonstration, each of us should endeavor to bring 3 to 5 of our friends to it every week. That's one way in which we can expand. And if we can't do that, if we're in a city where there's not a protest, or for some reason it's hard to bring friends, bring the ethic, the ethos, the spirit of the protest back into your life, back into your Jewish life. Make sure that organizations, synagogues, schools with which you're affiliated know about this and do not marginalize it and do not dismiss it because it's uncomfortable. Make sure they know that it represents really the majority of the state of Israel at this point in time. It's important to be loud, to be noisy, to be disruptive, and at the same time to be effective in communicating our message. But I think we have to do this. What can we do? And I think we need to seize the opportunity to shift both the conversation about Israel within the organized Jewish community, but also to further loosen that conformism that has told us we don't have the right to speak up if we find ourselves at odds with the position of the Israeli government. From what we hear, and this is something that recently was articulated by one of the organizers of the protest movement, Dr. Shikma Bressler in Israel. The movement draws strength from the fact that there are Israelis, American Jews, world Jews, and non-Jews gathering every single week to stand in solidarity with them. I think it's important to continue to do that, to send that sense of support, enthusiasm, and momentum to our siblings in Israel. I think it's also extremely important, as I said, to speak to political figures, decision makers, elected officials, and explain to them very carefully and respectfully why this movement has taken rise, and why it's so important for that elected representative to understand and support it, and indeed to give voice to support for it. When I was in Israel, interestingly, they piped in a message from the Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sanchez. So there are political figures around the world who are willing to express their support for the protest movement. And I think one of the most important ways we can do it is to marshal support among political officials in the United States to lend their support to it as well.
Thanks. I'd like to add to that. One thing people can do, and I think many of the people in this group are already members of our organization, but there are other grassroots groups. Connect to a group. Sometimes our group, sometimes other groups are organizing letters to Congress, are organizing letters to the White House. And when those comes in batches, they are so much more powerful than they come in drips and drops. So by connecting to an organization like ours or others, and by having other people connect and get updated and learn about developments and being fed with information that we distribute, that's almost like protesting in Kaplan. It's bringing people together. So I did not know that because I've never been involved in political action, but over the last 2.5, in the latter part of my life, in the last 2.5 months, 3 months, I'm involved in this group. And it's the bringing of people together that brings power to a political action. And so that's what we're trying to do. So connect.
Kol hakavod to you, Shaul. I really deeply appreciate it and all that you and your group have done.
So there's a question here. We're going to move to the next question. You were talking about the longer term goals after shelving or withdrawing the judicial overhaul. And so Ruth is asking, what about repealing the nation's state law as a long-term goal too? And I would add another question to that. You can respond to both. Let's suppose that the protesters all of us are successful, primarily those in Israel, are successfully in shelving the current laws. Shouldn't the first goal be some sort of a constitution or a basic law for legislation?
Yeah, so I'll try and answer both of them. I think that that remains a very long-term aspiration. But one of the rationales for not approving a constitution, because as we know, there were a good number of attempts to formulate a constitution, especially a young German Jewish lawyer by the name of Leo Kohn drafted a number of versions of a constitution. One of the reasons why there was not a constitution approved in 1948 or the early years of the state was because there was no consensus possible to agree on its terms. And I fear that the same remains true today. And I also think that it's unlikely by the same token to constitute a significant enough majority to repeal the nation state law. I personally would love to see the nation state law repealed. What I think might be possible, more possible, is a basic law which enshrines the principle of equality. And why do I say that? Number one, because this is what some of the data that Iran has gathered is showing, that people believe that equality is an indispensable feature of democracy. And two, it seems at some level, in some sense, to go back to the sense of Boucha, it seems hard to oppose a principle of equality if one believes that one state is democracy. So there's sort of the sort of instinctive sense that equality is a necessary ingredient of democracy, but there's also a sense of shame that you can't really oppose the principle of equality. Opponents of a basic law on equality would say, well, where does it end, right? Does it end beyond the green line? And that's a very real question that I think, in some sense, the settler project has forced upon us, which is to say, does that principle of equality get extended to residents of the West Bank? I'm willing to imagine that in a first phase, sort of in that long-term vision, the equality law would apply to citizens of the state of Israel. And what that would mean is that remaining obstacles to the full access of particularly Arab citizens of Israel to every corner of Israeli society would be lifted. I think it's extremely important symbolically and also practically. That might serve sort of in sort of a long-term vision to push towards the recognition that Israel either has to extend that same right of equality to residents of the West Bank, or it needs to make another arrangement and not enfranchise into the state of Israel several million Palestinians. That's a decision point that I think this next longer term step of a basic law on equality could set and could advance. So I just think it's, I mean, I may be completely wrong about this. I think it's less unlikely to be passed than either a constitution or an act that would repeal the nation state law.
Thank you. I guess I'll ask two questions about involving the Jewish community. Ruth and Ariella are asking. So Ruth is asking, federations have not been activist enough so far. They're typically not political, as you are aware. How do we impact their priorities, including funding? And Ariella is asking, around the same topic, how can we engage at least part of the Jewish community? For the most part, they are sitting on the fence and reluctant to participate in what they view as political.
Well, I guess I'd challenge the initial assumption that the Federation is not political. I think the federations are very political. It's a political stance to continue to either maintain silence, insist on that conformity, or actively support the current government. I think we need to make clear that that's a political act, and you're not really sitting it out when you say nothing. You're perpetuating the same system of conformity and the same sort of rock solid alliance between Jewish communal sensibilities and the policies of the government. And I think we need to crack that. I think we need to break that open and say that our deep commitment to Israel does not rest on the policies of the government. We don't believe that our values are always represented by the policies of the government of Israel, whatever it may be. That's just not the case. Some people will say, but what right do you have sitting thousands of miles away to exert your voice? And I've always thought, that there are different ways to construe Israel, the state of Israel. One is, and it certainly construes itself in these multiple ways as well. It's the state that embodies its citizens, and it's also the state that represents the interests of the Jewish people. And certainly Israeli governments, left, right, and center, have all asserted that right. Well, I think you can't sort of insist on that and then say Jews outside of Israel have no right to be heard in sort of that larger global polity of which Israel, the state of Israel, is such a central part. So I believe we have the right and responsibility to be heard as part of our family connections. And I mean that in sort of the global sense, but it also can mean in a very literal sense. I think we need to communicate that now to all the sort of alphabet soup of Jewish organizations in the United States, that we're simply not going to be prepared either to keep silent or to keep silent about their silence. At a minimum, they should be hosting presentations by leaders of the protest movement as a way of informing Jews about what's going on in Israel, and not inviting Bezalel Smotrich to speak to a gathering, or not. If you invite him, invite a leader of the protest movement as well. If you're the Israel Bonds, it's the responsible act to invite someone from the protest movement to talk about the importance of investing our moral and political capital in Israel at this very moment. So I think it's about standing up, not being bystanders, not watching what goes on and is being decided in our name, but really standing up, asserting our voice, and breaking old patterns that I think are particular and healthy now. And this is going to require a measure of chutzpah, a measure of boldness, a measure of courage on our part. But now is the time.
Thank you. So I just want to echo something that Professor Myers just said. Many members of this group probably know that about a week ago or so, we released a letter asking the American Jewish Committee that is having its global forum in Tel Aviv. We have released an open letter from this group requesting that they invite a protest movement speaker to talk to the global forum. And we have also asked the Jewish Federation to do the same. And so this is exactly the right time, as Professor Myers is saying, to talk to your organization and enhance this request. Dan is asking, do you see an effective angle to reach out to non-Jews like the broader authoritarian trend with autocrats using the same playbook to consolidate power? So he's asking, is there an effective way to reach out to non-Jews who might be interested in this fight?
I think so too. Yeah, I absolutely think so. I think there are many interested people, often people of faith, people who are interested in the well-being of the Holy Land and the state of Israel. We often think, when we think of people of faith, of conservative Christians, of the evangelical Protestant Kufi world, Christians United for Israel, which have been steadfast in support of right-wing and far right-wing policies for decades and have pumped hundreds of millions of dollars into the settlement project and I would say anti-democratic forces in Israel. But there are many other progressives of faith out there. And I think that's a very important constituency ripe for the picking, who will say, for a long time, it looked like Israel was heading in one direction and one direction only. Israel was heading further and further into this authoritarian, right-wing chauvinist direction. Well, here is this extraordinary manifestation of opposition to that current that sustained itself for 20 weeks. And I think that's certainly one area where it would make sense to invest our energies. Liberals of faith, as well as progressive organizations that for a long time have sort of given up on Israel because it seemed hopeless. But now there might be an opportunity to reverse some of that direction. But I'm particularly interested in progressives of faith as a source of potential collaboration. Dan is absolutely right. There's kind of an illiberal populist playbook. It's what Viktor Orban has called illiberal democracy in a 2014 speech. It's important to note that he and Bibi Netanyahu are good friends. They sort of came back into power in 2009, 2010, respectively, with a new commitment to really transform their respective societies along the lines of what they called illiberal democracy, a kind of very harsh form of majoritarianism, even though they may not have an actual majority. And that has become a standard feature of the playbook. There's a lot we can learn from talking to civil society actors in places like Hungary and Poland, who have been doing the Lord's work to uphold values of democracy and justice in those societies. I'm not sure that's certainly relevant for leaders of the protest in Israel. I don't know that people in the United States need to do that, because the United States is its own very distinctive political ecosystem with its own challenges. But I do think that there's something we can learn by looking at what's happened in those countries. We can look at how opposition has taken rise, how it's been suppressed, how it's resurfaced. And I would say that for those of us in the United States, we definitely need to consider the non-Jewish world, the non-Jewish progressive world, progressive centrist world as potential allies in our work.
Okay, we're getting close to the hour and close to the discussion. So David, as a last comment, project us a year forward. A year from now, I'm going to invite you to another webinar. Where we would be there?
Well, let's imagine a world in which Bibi Netanyahu is no longer the prime minister, in which this coalition, which is extraordinary in its extreme views, is no longer the governing coalition. Let's imagine a government in which, say, Benny Gantz or Yair Lapid is the prime minister. That, at one level, would represent a significant victory. But I would say our work wouldn't be done at that point. We need to continue to build on the momentum to really enshrine the values of democracy laid out in the Declaration of Independence, Cherut, Tzedek, V'Shalom, liberty, justice, and peace, in all that we do, in our political DNA, and continue to push. So we can hope for that measure of respite in a different government, and understand that our job would not be done. Lo aleinu ligmor hamalacha. It's not our task to finish the job, but we must persist in staying the course.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. Before we close, I want to thank David again. I want to remind everyone that next week we have a Zoom talk by Neta Barak-Koren. She is a renowned legal scholar from the Hebrew University, and she will talk about her perspective of the judicial overhaul and perhaps what can be done with the judicial overhaul moving forward. And I want to mention again that go visit our website, which I'll put on the chat here in a moment, just before we close. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. And we'll see you in the next Zoom. And thank you again, David, for excellent talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chazak v'amaz.
Okay, I will add the website here. So for those who want to put it in the chat. Okay. We will communicate, let's see. So let me close the recording, stop the recording.